We're just on the cusp of the release of The Last of Us Part 2, Naughty Dog's final game for PlayStation 4. It's a game that promises to push some new technical boundaries on the system and showcases what is possible when a huge team and tons of talent and money is thrown at a major project. This is a very big game, and it's a very impressive one. And there is a lot to talk about today. But first, and a little bit of a different thing, I am joined by my good friend and colleague, Richard Ledbetter.
Hello there, John. How's it all going? So where do we begin with this one? Because obviously there's going to be a lot of video content going live today, video reviews, but we're not running a video review today, so why is that?
Yes, and that's the different part. Normally, for these big releases, I love to do these nicely edited videos showcasing the best visual features in the game. But in this case, the restrictions of what we can capture and show are extremely limited, which means there's so much of the game and so many visually impressive moments, and moments that aren't even really spoilers, that I want to showcase what Naughty Dog has done that isn't really possible in this initial video. So what we decided to do today is, one, we're going to take a look at the game running on PlayStation 4 and the Pro, see how it runs, see what the resolution difference is, and all that stuff. We're going to discuss this game in comparison to the original The Last of Us, talk about some of its gameplay and visual features, and of course, maybe muse over the possibilities of what can be done on PS5. So think of this as a more complete take on the game. Whereas our preview coverage was limited to that little sliver, we can at least talk about everything in the game. So that's what we're about to do.
But the full tech review, the full John Linneman treatment, that's going to be happening at launch or very close to it, right? Just so people know what they're getting.
Yes. Oh yes, of course. That's important to specify. That video is still being worked on, and it will hit right as the game releases. So be sure to check that out when it does hit. But for now, let's talk about what we can look at. And that is, I'd say a technical and visual masterpiece from Naughty Dog. Just amazing looking game here.
Yeah, I mean, on the Digital Foundry Slack channel, you've been just sharing screenshots for the past week. And it just gets better and better, doesn't it?
It's one of those things where I find myself taking screenshots, videos, capture just like constantly, like around every corner. And there's a good reason for that. And we'll touch on some of that. But to begin with, let's jump into the whole PS4 versus PS4 Pro thing. So Naughty Dog has some nice history with the Pro. They have updated The Last of Us Remastered and Uncharted 4 to support the new console in the past, but this is the first game they've released, I guess barring The Lost Legacy, which is, it's still kind of its own game, but this is the first true from the ground up PS4 Pro developed game that they've released to date. But the setup is remarkably similar to Uncharted 4 in that you get 1080p on the base PS4 and 1440p on the PS4 Pro.
Yeah, so this is like a ground-up Pro project in many ways, but the underpinnings are essentially those that were established with Uncharted 4. So, yeah, 1440p from start to finish, no dynamic resolution or anything like that, right?
Not that I've seen. No, it seems to be just a locked 1440p with some excellent anti-aliasing. And honestly, image quality is quite good because there's a lot of post-processing, things like film grain, depth of field, and other techniques all used here. It has a very filmic look to it, which works really well in a game like this. So that's key.
Yeah, it is clean, isn't it? There's no, here's the thing. We talk about 1440p and it doesn't look great on a whole bunch of Pro titles. But this 1440p is backed by one of the best anti-aliasing solutions on the market, bar none, I think. It just looks, essentially you're losing a bit of clarity, perhaps, versus a native 4K presentation. But when you're running it on a 4K screen, you're getting a properly impressive sight.
Exactly, and that's the key takeaway here. It looks great on both machines, actually. And that also spills over into the actual details. Usually, I love to go into these side-by-side comparisons and really showcase how different games compare against different competing machines. But in this case, it's basically identical.
The same with Uncharted 4, really. It was, essentially the same thing, just at a different resolution. And even then, the resolution differential was kind of mitigated by that incredible TAA implementation they got there. Yeah.
And the thing that really strikes me, though, is when you see this game running, and then you consider the age of the PS4. I mean, it really it is something special. And no matter which PS4 you're on, of course, HDR is supported, and it's very different from obviously what Uncharted 4 would look like, in that this is a very dark, indirectly lit game. So HDR isn't going to have the same pop as some of those other games, but at the same time, I found it very effective in that areas where you're exploring, say, a darkened building and you have windows into the outside, the contrast between light and dark, it's very strong and it looks really, really convincing. So that's a good thing. And of course, there's plenty of options in the menu to adjust it as well. So that's great. And in fact, honestly, the options menu is packed with adjustments, including, accessibility options, visual settings, sound tweaks, like all this stuff. It's loaded, but that's what Naughty Dog's known for, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So the other side of the coin then, regarding PS4 versus Pro, is going to be performance, of course. And the news is good, but also not the most exciting for us, I suppose, in that you get a very stable 30 frames per second most of the time with occasional dips. And I mentioned this in the preview, but we can show a little bit more here in this one, but not all of it. So let me clarify that. Basically, the big problem I've noticed is that water seems to trigger the few dips that I did notice, and those dips occur primarily on the PS4 Pro.
Okay, that's interesting.
So it's not bad. You can see here in this scene, we're just getting these little drops along the way as you play. But if we do the same section here on the base PS4, you can see you get a perfectly stable 30 frames per second. And I found this to be consistent throughout, where the Pro is generally just a little bit behind on performance, but it's such a minor thing that it doesn't really matter, and it's not worth lowering the resolution. Which, by the way, if you set your PS4 Pro to 1080p, it just downscales and runs exactly the same. So yeah, but then there is also, there are sections, of course, that we can't show in this video review yet, but we can work around that by showing the frame rate graph. So here it is. There's no video behind this, but you can see, use your imagination. You can see it's a little bit slower on the PS4 Pro in this scene. So, what can I say?
But it is generally, the general thing is that it's water that causes the drops.
Primarily. You'll notice them occasionally in other spots, but I found that in almost every case, just being around large pools of water, streams, things like that, that will drop the frame rate a little bit. But I think it's interesting to discuss frame rate as it relates to this game, in the sense that the performance by and large is a non-issue. It's solid. It's not really the story here. But if you go back and look at the original The Last of Us on PlayStation 3, it really contrasts between the two games released right at the end of the generation, where this game is stable, but the original game is just I hate to say awful, but it is. It's not smooth. Compared to what they did with Uncharted 2 and 3, clearly the game design for The Last of Us was just overly ambitious for the PS3, and you really saw that in terms of overall frame rate. The performance drops a lot. It is often below 30 frames per second. And I think that perfectly summarizes sort of the difference between last gen and this gen. We saw a lot more stable 30 frames per second frame rates this time around versus last, where just getting to 30 was an achievement and not even a common one.
Yeah, definitely. I guess last gen, on the PlayStation 3 side of things in particular, GPU was kind of off balance with CPU power. So you did tend to see quite a lot of performance issues across the entire console generation. I think in the case of The Last of Us, though, as you say, Uncharted 2 and 3, they had their issues, but by and large, they are a lot more locked to the 30 frames per second target than The Last of Us. I just get the idea that The Last of Us was a technological statement from Naughty Dog and a farewell to the system. They wanted to push that thing as far as it would go, and the unfortunate casualty of that was that the performance level wasn't quite where it should be. I guess the counterpoint to that, of course, is that in pretty short order, we got The Last of Us remastered on the PS4, which comprehensively addressed that issue. So yeah, but it is interesting, as you say, to compare the priorities, gen on gen. Last of Us versus The Last of Us Part 2. Performance is pretty much solid on the new game. I don't think that's a concern at all. I mean, it is, as you say, always more interesting from a digital Foundry perspective to talk about something that isn't a flat line. But that's pretty much what you're getting here on the frame rate graph.
Yeah, that's precisely right. And that's kind of what gets us into more discussion about what they've done with the technology in The Last of Us Part 2, both in terms of game design and what the game can offer to the players as a presentational experience. And this is where it differs a lot from the original game. This isn't a review, but in terms of raw gameplay, what you do, the way the interactions work, the level design, all of that, I feel this is a tremendous improvement over the original in some very key areas. And some of this is driven by the technology, and some of it's just sort of, I guess, learning from creating these games for so long and sort of evolving the approach they've taken with the original. So by that I mean, basically The Last of Us Part 2 features a world that is significantly larger. I typically describe this as wide linear design. It's not an open world game. And by that, typically an open world game has you going from A to B. You're basically doing fetch quests, following a map, you're just going to checkpoints. And that's not the case here. And in fact, there is no indicator of where to go at any point. You do have a map now, but there's no direct go this way kind of signaling.
Okay.
And that instantly makes this a lot more fascinating to play, because the size and scale of Seattle and the areas around it is so much larger that it actually starts to feel like you're exploring rather than just following a linear path through the world.
Right.
And that means you can enter many more buildings. There's a lot more detail in each building. Already kind of a hallmark of the original, but there's just so much more to see this time.
Okay.
And that's something I think the original really struggled with. Those areas where you had the largest maps to explore tended to struggle the most on the PS3.
Yeah, but I think what you're trying to say here is essentially that this wide linear approach, I mean, it's basically giving you control of where you go in the game, although the overall objective is kind of the same, versus the more tunnel-like approach that we saw in the first one, right?
Precisely. Like, imagine you need to, say, get to this point on the map. You only see it from visually looking across the world or, through a story sequence. But getting there, you can go down one street, take another street. You can go through a building. You can go around a building. You can go through a completely different part of town. And that may seem like, okay, no big deal. You're just exploring. But what makes it interesting is, again, the enemy encounters. Because there are enemies around, both humans and clickers and the infected and all that. And getting around them and being ambushed by them in spots is really exciting. And I found myself sort of scrambling around these structures and dealing with enemies in ways that was a lot more engaging than the original. I mean, we already talked about how the AI and such seems improved, and things like adding the ability to go prone and crawling through grass. But that's really important here. It just makes navigating the battlefield, dealing with threats, especially threats that you didn't see coming, much more exciting and interesting, especially when they start exploring the buildings that you might be in. And a lot of these buildings you don't need to go into, but the enemies will come find you there. And all of these things were concepts in the original game, and they were somewhat explored, but you always felt the constraints of the PlayStation 3. And by opening up the world, increasing what you can do, like technically, like there's just more moves, if you will, like everything's more engaging. Like a good example is just if you get in close and you get into a melee battle, you need to time your dodging, your attacks, everything, and it works really well. And that ties in then to things like the animation system, where when you attack somebody, depending on what you're standing next to, object-wise, that can influence the animation and the way it plays out. Smashing something through a window, throwing them over a counter, all that stuff. Mm-hmm. It's really neat to see it just sort of play out, because it all kind of flows so well now.
Mm-hmm. So when we go back to the classic E3 gameplay trailer that we saw, where combat actually looked extremely fluid and context sensitive to the environment, do you think that has actually been realized in the final game?
I'd say they're about 90% there, and that the overall experience is very similar to that. Things like crawling under an object and the way they pull you out, the way that enemies can surprise you. There's a lot of stuff that occurs. It's very similar to that. Grabbing objects as you move along, like all that stuff. Even pulling arrows. If you get shot with an arrow, you have to hold R1 to pull the arrow out. Stuff like that. It is all there. But there is some fluidity in that original trailer. And it's something I plan to do a separate video on down the line, by the way. It isn't quite to that degree.
Got it.
And that's fair. I mean, these early demos, that's often the way things go. But yeah.
Okay, so the first game had quite a few... should we say, gameplay staples, particularly in terms of the progression puzzles. So how has that evolved for The Last of Us Part 2?
Yeah, that's another thing that's changed. If you've played the original, you've probably spent a lot of time moving dumpsters around and putting ladders up against walls. And I feel like they've made a statement by the first dumpster you encounter doesn't occur for many, many hours into the game. And even then, you only really have to do that trick maybe 2 or 3 times, and each time it's a different puzzle, as like one of them involves timing it, like setting it up on a slope, running down, pulling a chain, and getting it through the gate, stuff like that. So it doesn't feel like you're repeating those same actions as much. There's just more variation in actual navigation and puzzle solving this time. And when you couple that with the much larger world, I just think it's a more interesting game overall. Now, obviously, talking about this kind of game design stuff, it's not exactly what we normally do here, but I think a lot of this is just an example of how it's evolved from a technical standpoint and a gameplay standpoint that comes from being a next generation game versus PS3.
Right. Yep. Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because the storage solution on the PlayStation 4 isn't fundamentally a generational leap in the way that it is with PlayStation 5, but we are getting this much bigger world here, and there's much more to do, there's more variety in there, different ways to go through the game, which I find fascinating. Does that have any sort of implications on perhaps replaying it again and doing it in a different way?
So there's actually 2 points there. One, I did find replaying these sections on the 2 consoles, it is interesting because I started to discover so many more routes and ways to navigate the world. And it really makes you appreciate how large the environments can be, even when you're inside an area. Like in that demo we looked at in the preview that was shown at State of Play, the route that they take. There's other ways through that area that are also interesting. And that really starts to bring to mind playing stealth games like Metal Gear, Splinter Cell. And in fact, in terms of the way it plays, it does remind me a lot of something like Metal Gear Solid 5, honestly. The other point on that, though, when it comes to replay, and this is a slight complaint, is loading.
Oh, wow.
So this, like other Naughty Dog games, the game is basically always streaming data. It spends so much time doing that in the background as you play. The cutscenes are predominantly real-time, like they were in Uncharted 4, which can be adjusted using the photo mode to some degree, so you can really kind of play with it there. But the problem is, if you try to skip these cutscenes, which is an option, the loading between them is long enough where you're like, well, maybe I shouldn't have skipped it because it takes almost as long just to watch it as it does to skip it. So if you're just trying to go through it again, that might be frustrating, but at the same time, they do have an encounters menu, which allows you to select all the different sequences in the game.
Right.
And just play through them, a little bit at a time, basically skipping a lot of the story stuff. And the sequences are good. Like, it really is a lot of fun to play. Like that E3 2018 demo you mentioned, that is in the game. We can't show it here yet, unfortunately, but it's there. They moved some things around, which is curious. Like they were torturing that guy hanging from some sort of device in the demo, and you can see it in the demo here, but in the final game, it's actually moved to a completely different section of the map. So, and they kind of rearrange some of the stores, and I do enjoy that kind of thing, just seeing how stuff evolves over time.
Yeah, I think, there's 2 points here. First of all, the background streaming technology. It's amazing what you don't actually see, what is actually happening in the background. And when you actually go and revisit those areas via the menu, you're kind of exposed to what is previously happening in the background. So that's interesting. But I guess storage-wise, we fully expect to see some kind of PlayStation 5 rendition of the game in the fullness of time. Maybe at launch. I really hope so. But I guess That part at least wouldn't be a problem. The loading, you'd expect it to be pretty much instant. But projecting forward, what do you kind of expect to see from PS5 based on your playthrough so far?
Well, with this original game, it's a situation where if they were to update it with a patch, I think if they wanted to get something out at launch, it would probably have to be maybe a performance patch. Perhaps they could hit native 4K, maybe at 60 FPS. That would be a nice thing to do. Of course, loading would be improved dramatically. But if there was more time to pour into working on a PS5 iteration of this game, I would actually like to see ray traced global illumination. And only in so much that, so the global illumination, which I'll talk in more detail about in the full experience, the full fat video, it's fantastic. Now, this is an offline baked solution, of course. There is no real-time time of day changing, so that's fine. But they've really captured the look of indirect light, of being in an area that's mostly bathed in shadow or very dim lights from the sky. It's a very rainy place. I mean, it is Seattle after all. So there's a lot of precipitation to deal with. Mm-hmm. But the problem is as good as all that looks, when you're in certain areas, the shading on interactive objects isn't going to be quite as robust as the more static ones. So there is a sense that some objects don't quite sit as naturally within the world. And this is something I feel you could combine ray trace GI with the methods they're currently using to further enhance that. Maybe even ray trace shadows, basically something to accentuate what they're already doing with their current techniques, but enhancing it and making it look even more realistic and grounded. And I feel as this is a PlayStation 4 game, it seems feasible at least that you could see some sort of RT features grafted on. But again, it's hard to say what's possible given the time frames and all that. We'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah, from my perspective, there's what I'd like to see and what I expect to see. What I expect to see, I think, the lowest amount of friction would simply be to up resolution to 4K, possibly move frame rate to 60 frames per second. I think those are the big wins, and that's precisely what they targeted in The Last of Us Remastered for PS4 and PS4 Pro. So, that's kind of what I expect to see. But, The Last of Us Remastered did have that 4K 30 mode where they did attempt to increase precision, and it would be great just to keep 30 frames per second, but for Naughty Dog to say, right, okay, this is kind of the sort of thing we'd love to do on PlayStation 5, and then roll out stuff like, real-time global illumination, reflections possibly, although they're pretty awesome to begin with as they are right now. So yeah, I mean, two potentially different approaches there. I do expect to see something, but in what time frame, I don't know. But, I just think that first party is kind of like Sony's biggest strength. And I'd really like to see a robust level of support for PS5 from launch with patches and with original content. And I think this game could play a key part in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe it will. I mean, at the very least, we should at least see improved loading. So there is that. That's like at the absolute basic level. But overall, still, this is PS4. It's now. It's insane what they achieved on 2013 hardware. There's so much more to say about this visually. It really is absurd, some of these sequences. So I'm disappointed by what we can show in this video, because as good as these areas look that you've seen thus far, there's a lot more going on here.
Yeah, I think the stipulation is basically that we can't show any content that hasn't already been shown, which presents real difficulties for us in terms of, areas like Seattle, which are genuinely game-changing compared to anything you've seen at this moment in time. But, I can kind of see why they'd do it. It's basically to protect for spoilers in the run-up to launch. And although, we'd really take care not to show any story beats, it's a really difficult thing to police to all publications. And one man's spoiler is just, another man's fact, that they'd like to know before launch. So I can kind of see why the situation is as it is. But I guess we're just going to have to wait for the full fat experience.
That's right, and it will be here soon enough. And yeah, it is interesting. You're right, though. The embargo areas are actually all just missions off to the side. Basically, the whole game is set up around sort of the Seattle area you're exploring. And when you arrive at your destination, it's almost like a set level, if you will. That's kind of what we have here. So it's all very seamless, though, so it works really well.
So we're swiftly approaching the time limit that the embargo imposes upon us for talking about The Last of Us Part 2, so we'd better wrap this one up, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's about all we can say for this one. Hopefully there's some interesting and useful information in this video, but really I'm eager to present more about it, because one of my favorite things to do is just showcase impressive visuals and discuss sort of the thoughts behind it, and at least share my own thoughts on what makes them look so good, because you can look at something and think that looks nice, but it's really fun to understand why it looks so nice, and that's what we plan to do. So we'll have that soon. But for this video, thanks for joining me, Rich.
My pleasure, John.
And if you guys enjoyed it, as always, be sure to come find us over on Twitter. Check out our Patreon, where you can download a direct 4K version of this video if you want to see it in higher quality. And of course, ring the notification bell and all that goodness. So until next time, this is John and Rich signing off.